The most disciplined man who ever lived broke down completely. Not once, not in private, repeatedly. And he documented every single moment of it. Marcus Aurelius ruled the greatest empire in human history. He commanded roughly 60 million people. He had philosophers as teachers, generals as subordinates, and the full power of Rome at his fingertips. And yet, on some mornings, he could not get out of bed. This is not a metaphor. He wrote about it, in his own handwriting, in a private journal he never intended anyone to read. So here is the question that will haunt this entire video. If the most powerful, most philosophically trained man in the ancient world was mentally falling apart, what exactly did he do about it? What were the specific exercises? The brutal ones. The ones he used not when life was comfortable, but when everything was collapsing around him. By the end of this video, you will have those exercises, not the polished, motivational version, the real ones. The ones that Marcus, Seneca, and Epictetus actually used when they were losing. Because here is what most people who read Stoicism get wrong. They think it is a philosophy of calm. It is not. It is a philosophy built for catastrophe. Let us start with the problem that made all of it necessary. Marcus Aurelius did not rule Rome during peaceful times. He ruled during plagues that killed between 5 and 10 million people. During wars on 3 frontiers simultaneously. During betrayal by generals he trusted. During the slow death of a son he had raised to be his heir, who turned out to be one of the worst emperors Rome ever produced. And through all of it, he kept writing. Not speeches, not commands. Private notes, self-arguments, instructions to himself about how to keep functioning when everything was falling apart. The Meditations was not a philosophy book. It was a survival manual, written in real time by a man who was genuinely struggling to survive his own mind. This distinction matters because it changes what the exercises mean. These were not theoretical techniques. They were field-tested in the worst conditions imaginable. An empire on the edge. A body failing from illness. A legacy crumbling. The exercises you are about to learn were written by someone in the middle of the crisis, not looking back on it from safety. Marcus Aurelius called them his mental exercises. We would call them something else. Let us call them what they are, the most brutal psychological tools ever documented. The first one had a name, Memento Mori. Remember that you will die, and before you say you already know this one, understand that you almost certainly do not know how he actually used it. Most people treat Memento Mori as a gentle reminder about mortality. A tattoo, a phrase on a coffee mug. That is not what Marcus meant. What he actually prescribed to himself was far more specific and far more violent. Every morning, before leaving his tent on military campaigns, and he spent more of his reign on campaign than in Rome, Marcus would rehearse his own death, not abstractly, in detail. He would imagine the specific way he was likely to die, the illness, the battle, the betrayal. He would hold that image until it stopped producing fear and started producing clarity. This is not a comforting exercise. It is designed to be uncomfortable. The discomfort is the mechanism, because what Marcus discovered, and what neuroscience now confirms, is that the mind's relationship to fear changes fundamentally when you stop avoiding the feared thing and start examining it directly. The modern equivalent: if you are afraid of losing your job, you do not meditate on gratitude. You sit down and you actually think through, in specific detail, what losing your job would look like. Not to catastrophize, to desensitize. Marcus was performing exposure therapy on himself 2,000 years before the term was invented. But here is what most people miss about memento mori, as Marcus practiced it. He did not stop at death. He extended it to everything he valued. Every morning, before anyone saw him, Marcus would remind himself that his power was temporary. His health was temporary. His relationships were temporary. His reputation was temporary. He called this process examining the things you cling to, and the exercise was not to stop caring about them. It was to care about them correctly, without the desperation that comes from believing you cannot survive their loss. He wrote, "Of each person, think that they will soon die, and of yourself the same." And then, how many a Chrysostom, how many a Socrates, how many an Epictetus have time already swallowed up? He was not being morbid. He was building what psychologists now call psychological flexibility. The ability to hold your values and your attachments without being destroyed by the threat of losing them. This was exercise 1, and most people cannot complete it because they stop too early. They think of death for 2 seconds, and then their mind redirects to something less threatening. Marcus held it for extended periods, until the feeling changed, until he was on the other side of the fear, looking back at it. Exercise 2 had no poetic name. It was simply this: the view from above. When Marcus was in the middle of a political crisis, when senators were conspiring against him, when his generals were dying, when the decisions he made would determine whether thousands of people lived or died, he would do something that initially sounds like escapism. He would mentally ascend, not spiritually, structurally. He would imagine himself rising above the situation until he could see it the way an historian might see it 500 years later. He would deliberately place his crisis in geological time, in the scale of centuries. He would ask himself, will this matter in 100 years? In 1,000? This is not the same as telling yourself your problems do not matter. That would be false comfort, and Marcus had no patience for false comfort. The view from above is about proportion. It is about recalibrating what requires your full catastrophic response and what is simply the ordinary turbulence of a human life. He wrote about seeing everything from above: the herds of men and women, the births, the marriages, the deaths, the courts convening and dispersing, the festivals of different peoples, the negotiations of different tribes. All of it, from a sufficient distance, resembled the same pattern repeating. The exercise produced a specific result. It did not make the problem smaller. It made the response proportionate. Marcus went back to the crisis with the same information, but a different nervous system. The problem had not changed. His relationship to it had. Now here is where this becomes interesting. Because you might be thinking, this sounds like detachment, like not caring. And that would be exactly wrong. Seneca, who was the other great practitioner of these mental exercises, made this explicit. He was not trying to care less. He was trying to care more accurately. The difference is critical. Seneca had lost everything, multiple times. He was exiled by one emperor, Claudius, and recalled to Rome by that same emperor's court, then appointed tutor to Nero, who he then had to serve as a tutor and advisor, while knowing that Nero might kill him at any moment, which Nero eventually did. During this period, Seneca developed what may be the most psychologically sophisticated exercise in Stoic practice. He called it the premeditation of adversity, and it was more extreme than memento mori. The exercise Deliberately imagine not just your death, but your complete ruin. Every morning, or in times of crisis, you identify the worst realistic outcome of your current situation. And then, you live in that outcome mentally until you have found a way to survive it with your character intact. Not your career, not your reputation, not your comfort, your character. The question Seneca asked himself was not, "Can I avoid this disaster?" It was, "If this disaster becomes real, can I remain someone I respect?" This sounds abstract until you understand the circumstances in which he practiced it. Seneca was managing an emperor who had already executed his own mother, who had killed his wife, who was becoming increasingly paranoid and volatile. Every day that Seneca spent in Nero's court was a day he might be accused of something and ordered to die. So every morning, he practiced dying, not metaphorically. He ran the mental simulation of Nero sending soldiers to his door. He imagined the sentence. He imagined the method. Nero's preferred method for powerful men was forced suicide, a choice of how you would die, which was considered a mercy. Seneca imagined choosing. He imagined the act. And by imagining it completely, he diffused its power over him. There is a documented moment. Tacitus recorded it when the soldiers actually came, when Nero actually sent the order. And Seneca's behavior that day was exactly what his mental exercises had prepared him for. He did not beg. He did not panic. He gathered his friends. He gave them his final thoughts. And he died with a composure that Tacitus, a man who had no reason to flatter him, described as remarkable. He had practiced that moment so many times mentally that when it became real, he had already been through it. Epictetus used a different version of this exercise, and his version was, if anything, more brutal. Epictetus was born a slave. He did not choose Stoicism because it sounded interesting. He chose it because it was the only philosophy that gave him a framework for maintaining dignity under conditions he could not change. He could not free himself. He could not control his circumstances. He could not protect his body from what his master chose to do with it. What he could control was exactly one thing: his response. Epictetus developed what he called the dichotomy of control, and he did not present it gently. He presented it as a demand, a diagnostic, a constant, exhausting interrogation of every situation you encounter. The exercise. When anything happens to you, anything, regardless of scale, you must immediately and without exception ask a single question. Is this within my control, or is it not? And then you must act accordingly. Not feel accordingly. Act. This sounds simple. It is not. Because the human mind is extraordinarily skilled at blurring the boundary between what you control and what you do not. Epictetus spent his entire life sharpening that boundary until it was absolute. He said, "Of things, some are in our power, and some are not. In our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not in our power are our body, our reputation, command, and in a word, whatever is not of our own doing." He was a slave when he wrote that. His body belonged to someone else. His location was not his choice. His labor was not his choice. And he was describing freedom. Here is the modern application of the exercise. You receive difficult news. Something breaks. Something fails. Something you cared about ends. Before you respond emotionally. And Epictetus was not asking you to avoid emotion. You run the diagnostic. You ask, with genuine rigor, what portion of this is actually within my control? What specific action can I take that is within my control? And then you put every unit of your mental energy into that portion, and you release the rest. The release is not passive. It is not resignation. It is an active, disciplined redirection of finite cognitive resources. Epictetus practiced this constantly. He used it when he was mistreated, when he was mocked for being a slave-turned-philosopher, when his former master, in a documented story, broke his leg deliberately to test whether Epictetus would show pain. He said calmly that his leg was going to break. When it broke, he said, "Did I not tell you?" Whether you take that story literally or as an illustration, the principle it demonstrates is real. The Stoics were not performing calm. They had trained calm into themselves through years of exercises so difficult that most modern readers cannot complete them for more than 30 seconds. Now, we reach the exercise that Marcus, Seneca, and Epictetus all practiced, but that nobody talks about when they summarize Stoicism for a modern audience. Because it is the least comfortable one. They called it practicing failure. Marcus did not call it that exactly. He approached it through what he wrote about adversity being the raw material of virtue. The idea, you cannot develop courage without having something to be afraid of. You cannot develop patience without having something to endure. You cannot develop discipline without being tempted to abandon it. Therefore, the obstacles in your life are not obstacles to your philosophical development. They are the philosophical development. The fire that Marcus spent his reign walking through was not a test he needed to survive in order to then begin practicing Stoicism. It was the practice. Every morning, Marcus wrote in his journal not to clarify his victories, but to examine his failures. What had he done wrong? Where had he been impatient? Where had he been vain? Where had he allowed his anger to direct his behavior instead of his reason? He was not doing this to punish himself. He was doing it as diagnostic data. This is why the Meditations reads the way it does. It is relentlessly self-critical, not in a self-pitying way, in a clinical way. The tone is a man examining himself the way a doctor examines a patient, without sentiment, without drama, with the single goal of accurate assessment. The exercise: take whatever is going wrong in your life right now. Do not comfort yourself. Do not minimize it. Do not blame circumstance. Ask, what does this situation require of me that I currently do not have? And then, what specific practice, repeated over time, would develop that quality? This is the exercise that separated the Stoics from every other philosophy of their era. They were not trying to feel better. They were trying to become better at functioning under conditions that would not improve. Because that is the fundamental Stoic premise, and it is a brutal one. The world does not owe you favorable conditions. The world has never offered favorable conditions to anyone worth knowing about. The question is not how to create favorable conditions. The question is who you become in the conditions that actually exist. Marcus ruled Rome during a plague. Seneca survived multiple exiles and a tyrant. Epictetus was born a slave. None of them had favorable conditions. All of them built, through specific daily exercises, a mind that could function without them. And here is the final piece, the insight that Marcus spent 40 years arriving at, that he wrote in his journal not for publication, but for himself. On a night when the empire was genuinely in danger and he was genuinely not sure it would survive. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He was not being poetic. He was documenting the conclusion of a lifetime of mental exercises. The conclusion: the mind that has been trained through difficulty does not merely survive difficulty. It requires difficulty to function at its best. The obstacle is not what you overcome on the way to your destination. The obstacle is the destination. It is where you find out who you actually are. Every morning, in a tent on a military campaign, or in a palace during a plague, or in a prison cell, the Stoics sat down and did the work. The uncomfortable work. The work that most people skip, because it requires you to look directly at the things you most want to avoid looking at. Death, failure, loss, powerlessness. The gap between who you want to be and who you actually are. They looked directly, every day. And when everything fell apart, when Nero sent soldiers to Seneca's door, when Marcus watched his empire struggle to survive, when Epictetus's leg was broken by the man who owned him, they were not surprised. They had been there before, in their own minds, thousands of times. That is why they held. Not because the Stoics were superhuman, because they had practiced being human, completely and without flinching, until it no longer broke them. The question is not whether you will face a moment when everything falls apart. You will. The question Marcus left us is simpler and harder than any philosophy lecture. What are you doing this morning before anyone can see you to prepare for that moment? That question does not have a comfortable answer. But then, the Stoics never promised comfort. They promised something better, a mind that holds. But how do you build that mind when you are already in the middle of the collapse? That is the question Marcus could not answer until the very worst year of his reign. And what he discovered then changed everything about how he faced the years that came after. That story is next.